Welcome, friends. Tonight we leave behind the noise of the modern world and step quietly into the muddy lanes and flickering candlelight of the Middle Ages. Not into a castle nor a battlefield, but into the heart of the countryside, where life moved with the seasons and survival was a craft passed down through calloused hands. Imagine the slow rhythm of dawn in a thatched-roofed cottage, the soft clatter of wooden bowls, the steady hum of a spinning wheel, and the distant crow of a rooster echoing across fields. These were the lives of medieval peasants, people often dismissed in history as poor, grim, or unfortunate. But tonight we'll look again, because behind the hardship was something else, a deep connection to land and season. A life shaped by ritual, not rush. Community, not consumption. Meals were shared, labor was rhythmic, and though comforts were few, joys were simple and meaningful. A warm fire, a dry bed, the laughter of a neighbor after a long day. You'll discover how peasants found rest in routine, wisdom in nature, and resilience in each other. We'll uncover the quiet grace of a life close to the earth, where slowness wasn't a luxury, but a way of life. So lie back, let your breathing slow, and drift into a world where the stars still ruled the calendar, bread was made by hand, and peace was found not in having more, but in being together. This is why medieval peasants had the best lifestyle in history. Welcome to the journey. Waking with the rooster, a peasant's dawn ritual. In the deep, shadowed embrace of a medieval dawn, before the first tendrils of true light pierced the inky black, life stirred not by the chime of a clock nor the blare of a distant whistle, but by an ancient, instinctual alarm. It was the rooster, of course. His clarion call, ragged and insistent, would tear through the heavy quiet of the pre-dawn, a raw, organic summons that echoed across the huddle of thatched roofs and wattle-and-daub walls that comprised the village. For the peasant, for the countless generations before him and after, this was the beginning, not just of a day, but of a life lived in an unbroken cycle with the earth and its primal rhythms. Imagine it, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke from embers that still clung to life in the hearth. Inside the small, cramped hovel, the darkness was absolute, save for the faintest ghostly glow from those dying coals. The family, often a multi-generational tangle of limbs, lay pressed together on a shared pallet of straw, perhaps covered by coarse woolen blankets. The rooster's cry was not a sudden jolt, but rather a slow, permeating resonance that filtered through the thin walls, seeping into the deepest layers of sleep. It was a call that spoke of obligation, of an unyielding sun that would soon command the fields. There was no resisting it, no luxury of turning over for a few more precious moments of slumber. The concept simply didn't exist. Time, as we perceive it, was a fluid, unmeasured thing, dictated by the sun's journey and the pressing needs of the land. And the land, immutable and demanding, called early. The peasant, let us call him Thomas, would stir first. His movements were slow, deliberate, born of a deep-seated wariness that never truly left him, but also of a profound familiarity with this daily awakening. Each muscle, each sinew knew its purpose, understood the choreography of rising into the cold, still air. He would shift, perhaps nudging his wife Elara beside him, her breathing soft and even. The children, still lost in the innocent depths of their dreams, would remain undisturbed for a few more minutes. Thomas's bare feet calloused and accustomed to the uneven, often muddy floor that was simply packed earth, would meet the cold ground. There was no rush, no frantic scramble. It was a gentle, almost meditative unfolding. The sounds were muted, the rustle of straw, a quiet cough, and the faint crackle as he nudged the embers with a stick, coaxing them back to life. The hearth was the heart of the home, the giver of warmth and the promise of sustenance. Thomas would carefully add a few small pieces of dried wood, perhaps some gathered kindling, watching as the embers rekindled, spitting tiny sparks that briefly illuminated the rough-hewn walls. The smoky scent would deepen, a comforting, familiar perfume that spoke of home and continuity. This was not merely lighting a fire, it was tending to the very breath of their existence, ensuring the warmth that would chase away the night's chill and prepare the first meager meal. As the fire caught, casting dancing shadows, Ilara would begin to stir. Her awakening was as measured as his, her body aching from a day of endless tasks, but her spirit attuned to the needs of the household. She would rise, perhaps gathering a bit of water from the large earthenware pot that held their supply, brought from the well the evening before. Every drop was precious, every resource managed with an economy born of scarcity. There was no faucet, no endless flow, only what was painstakingly carried. The dawn ritual extended beyond the immediate waking. It was about preparation, about setting the stage for the unyielding demands of the day. Thomas might tend to the few animals kept within or just outside the dwelling, a scrawny chicken or two, perhaps a piglet that rooted in the nearby muck. Their low grunts and clucks were part of the tapestry of sound, another layer in the quiet symphony of the awakening village. These animals were not pets in the modern sense, but living assets, sources of food, eggs, or future income. Their well-being was directly tied to the family's survival. There was a profound silence that often accompanied these pre-dawn hours, broken only by the natural world. The wind might sigh through the cracks in the walls, the distant hoot of an owl might still linger, or the soft patter of rain against the thatch. It was a time for reflection, for the quiet contemplation that comes naturally when the world is stripped back to its essentials. In the absence of artificial light, of constant noise, the mind settled into a different rhythm, one that mirrored the slow turning of the seasons. The children, roused by the increasing activity and the growing warmth from the hearth, would slowly emerge from their straw nest. There was no reluctance, no childish protests against the early hour. From their earliest days, they understood their place in this cycle. Playtime would come later, after chores, after the fields had been tended. For now, it was about contributing, about learning the rhythms of work that would define their entire lives. The family unit was not just a collection of individuals, it was an economic engine, each member a vital cog in its perpetual motion. This early hour, this slow, deliberate waking, was a testament to a life deeply intertwined with the natural world. There was no separation, no escape. The weather dictated the work, the sun dictated the hours, and the earth dictated the yield. The rooster, in his insistent, guttural cry, was not just an alarm clock. He was a living symbol of this unbreakable bond, a herald of the enduring cycle that defined the peasant's existence. And as the first true sliver of orange stained the eastern sky, painting the rough outlines of the distant trees, the peasant's day, as it had for centuries, truly began. The quiet preparation gave way to the inevitable, relentless march towards the fields, where the real work, the true essence of their lives, awaited. This was not a life of choice, but of necessity, undertaken with a stoicism born of generations, a quiet strength that underpinned the very fabric of their world. As the pre-dawn embers of the hearth began to glow with a more confident light, casting long, wavering shadows across the small hovel, the true nature of the peasant home revealed itself. This was not a dwelling designed for comfort in the modern sense, nor even for privacy. It was a shelter, a primal refuge against the raw, unyielding elements, and its very construction spoke volumes about the lives lived within its confines. The floor, for instance, was simply the earth itself, packed, uneven, often damp, and inevitably muddy. It was a constant, tangible connection to the land that sustained them, and simultaneously a relentless reminder of their humble place within it. Imagine stepping onto that floor each morning. There was no polished wood, no soft rug, no smooth flagstone. Instead, there was the cool, yielding sensation of earth beneath bare feet, sometimes gritty with dust, often slick with condensation, and frequently, especially after a night of rain, a squelching expanse of mud. This mud was not merely an inconvenience, it was an integral part of their daily existence, tracked in from the fields, churned by livestock, and perpetually present. It clung to clothes, became embedded beneath fingernails, and seeped into every corner of their meager possessions. The walls, typically constructed of wattle and daub, a framework of woven branches plastered with a mixture of clay, dung, and straw, offered a flimsy barrier against the world outside. Cracks were commonplace, allowing errant drafts to whisper through and thin shafts of early light to penetrate the gloom. The thatched roof, while an excellent insulator against the winter cold and summer heat, occasionally yielded to persistent rain, sending drips into strategically placed pots or directly onto the earthen floor, adding to the pervasive dampness. This was a home built of necessity, from materials readily available: earth, wood, straw, and perhaps a few scavenged stones. There was no grand architecture, no aspirational design. Functionality reigned supreme. The central hearth, now steadily burning, was the focal point, its smoke curling upwards to escape through a smoke hole in the roof or simply permeating the entire space, giving the interior a perpetual smoky tang. This smoke, while sometimes irritating to the eyes, also served a purpose. It helped to preserve the thatch and discourage insects, a minor mercy in a life of constant battles against nature. Within these confined walls, life unfolded in a singular communal space. There were no separate bedrooms, no distinct living areas. The entire family, from the eldest grandparent to the youngest infant, shared this single room. Their possessions were few and utilitarian. A rough wooden chest for storing what little clothing they owned, perhaps a few stools or a simple table if they were fortunate, and the ever-present earthenware pots and wooden bowls for cooking and eating. Everything had a purpose, and nothing was extraneous. Clutter, as we know it, was a luxury they could not afford. The morning routine, once fully underway, highlighted this communal living. As Thomas tended the fire and Ilara fetched water, the children would be stirring, their young bodies still heavy with sleep, but their minds already shifting towards the day's tasks. There was no concept of a leisurely morning. Every moment was purposeful, every action leading towards the sustained effort of the day. The preparation of breakfast, a simple gruel or stale bread, was a joint effort, even for the youngest, who might be tasked with stirring the pot or fetching a forgotten utensil. The air, though still cool, began to warm slightly from the rekindled fire, battling against the inherent dampness of the earth floor. The family would move with practiced ease around each other, their bodies accustomed to the confined space, their movements economical and efficient. There was a quiet understanding, an unspoken choreography born of shared hardship and necessity. Personal space, a modern construct, was unknown. Proximity was a given, an inescapable reality of their existence. Outside,
The sounds of the waking village would begin to filter in. Another rooster's defiant crow, the distant lowing of cattle, the barking of a dog, perhaps the muffled voices of neighbors already tending to their own dawn rituals. These sounds formed a comforting, familiar backdrop, a confirmation that they were not alone in this relentless cycle of toil. The village was an extended family, a collective striving for survival against a world that often felt indifferent, if not outright hostile. The light, once a faint suggestion, now began to strengthen. Filtering through the smoke hole and any gaps in the walls, revealed the raw textures of their home, the rough, unplaned timbers, the uneven plaster, the straw protruding from the thatch. There was no attempt at ornamentation, no pursuit of aesthetic beauty. Beauty, for the medieval peasant, lay in the promise of a good harvest, in the health of their family, in the simple act of survival. This home, so stark and unadorned, was more than just walls and a roof. It was the epicenter of their world, the place where life began and ended, where joys were shared and sorrows endured. It was a crucible of resilience, forging bodies and spirits hardened by the constant demands of their existence. And as the morning progressed, as the family prepared to step out into the nascent light, leaving the smoky embrace of their hovel behind, they carried with them the imprint of that earthen floor, a constant reminder of their unbreakable bond to the land, and the raw, unvarnished reality of their medieval life. The mud outside awaited, but the mud inside was a part of them, a silent testament to a home built not of luxury, but of grit and unwavering endurance.
Breakfast of champions. Gruel. Again. With the fire now a cheerful, if modest, presence in the hearth, and bodies clad in their familiar coarse layers, the next essential ritual of the peasant's day would commence, the morning meal. To our modern sensibilities, breakfast is often a moment of choice, a fleeting indulgence, perhaps a burst of energy to fuel a busy commute. For the medieval peasant, however, breakfast was a stark, unvaried necessity, a meager ration designed not for pleasure, but for brute survival. It was, almost without exception, gruel. Again. Imagine the steam rising from a humble pot, the air thick with the earthy, slightly metallic scent of boiling grains. This was the dominant aroma of every peasant morning, a scent as synonymous with their lives as the damp earth beneath their feet. Gruel was the bedrock of their diet, a viscous porridge made from whatever grains were most available and cheapest: barley, oats, rye, or perhaps a mixture. Wheat, the prized grain, was often reserved for the lord, or for making the coarse, dark bread that might appear on their tables only a few times a week, if they were lucky. The preparation was simple, born of necessity and scarcity. Grains, often coarsely ground or simply crushed, would be simmered in water over the open fire, sometimes for hours, until they broke down into a thick, gloopy consistency. There were no elaborate recipes, no spices beyond what might be foraged locally, if anything at all. Perhaps a pinch of salt, if they could afford it, to enhance the otherwise bland flavor. The primary goal was to create a filling, energy-dense meal that would sustain them through hours of back-breaking labor in the fields. As the gruel bubbled, the family would gather round the hearth, their shadows dancing on the smoky walls. There was no formal table, perhaps just a low stool or a raised section of packed earth. Each member would receive a portion scooped into a simple wooden bowl or perhaps directly onto a trench carved into a piece of stale bread. There was no individual serving, no seconds, no complaints. Every mouthful was precious, every calorie accounted for. Children, even the youngest, understood the value of this meager sustenance, learned from infancy that food was not to be wasted. The act of eating was not a social event in the way we understand it. It was a silent, purposeful consumption. Hands, still rough from the chill of the morning and the first small chores, would bring the warm, thick mixture to mouths.
The texture would be coarse, perhaps chewy, a far cry from the refined cereals of today. The taste, unremarkable. But the feeling of warmth spreading through the belly, the dull ache of hunger beginning to recede, these were the true luxuries. This was the fuel for their bodies, the very essence of their ability to endure. Water, drawn fresh from the village well, would accompany the meal. Sometimes, if fruit was in season, a few foraged berries or apples might be added to the gruel, a rare burst of sweetness and acidity that would transform the mundane into something almost celebratory. But these were fleeting moments, seasonal deviations from the unyielding routine. For the most part, it was simply grain and water, a testament to the raw simplicity of their diet. The nutritional value of this diet was surprisingly robust in some ways. Grains, especially whole grains, provided complex carbohydrates essential for sustained energy. Fiber was abundant, but protein was often scarce. Meat was a rarity, perhaps only consumed on feast days or when a hunt yielded success, and even then only small portions. Dairy from their few animals might supplement the diet, but milk and cheese were also valuable commodities for sale or barter. Vegetables, often from their own small garden plot, would be more plentiful in season, but during the lean winter months, stored root vegetables and dried pulses would be the primary additions to the ubiquitous gruel. The breakfast was a quick affair. There was no lingering, no conversation beyond the bare essentials. The sun was rising higher, the fields were calling, and every minute spent at rest was a minute lost to labor. The bowls would be emptied, perhaps wiped clean with a piece of bread, or simply rinsed with water if it could be spared. Children would quickly finish, eager to begin their own chores, which might involve helping their parents, tending to animals, or gathering firewood. This daily meal, so humble and repetitive, was more than just food. It was a symbol of their continuous struggle, their unwavering reliance on the land, and their profound resilience. It was the energy that would power Thomas's back-breaking plowing, Ilara's endless spinning and weaving, and the children's vital contributions to the household economy. It was the first act of defiance against hunger, the foundational stone laid for another day of arduous, demanding work. And as they stepped out of their smoky hovel, the taste of plain gruel still lingering, they carried with them the silent understanding that this was their breakfast of champions, the fuel that allowed them to simply endure. A walk to work, across the field. The commute before shoes. With the meager breakfast consumed and the last wisps of smoke curling from the hovel's smoke hole, the medieval peasant family prepared for their morning commute. For us, this phrase evokes images of paved roads, humming vehicles, and bustling crowds. For Thomas and Ilara and their children, the journey to work was an entirely different communion with the world. It was a walk, often long, always across uneven terrain, and frequently undertaken without the luxury of shoes. It was a commute measured not in miles per hour, but in the slow, deliberate rhythm of bare feet on damp earth, a meditation in mud and silence before the day's true labor began. Imagine the dawn light now a little stronger, painting the village in muted grays and greens. The path, if one could call it that, was not a paved road, but a winding track, worn smooth over generations by countless footsteps, cart ruts, and the passage of livestock. There was no clear separation between village and farmland, the two blurred into one continuous landscape, a testament to the symbiotic relationship between the people and the soil that sustained them. Thomas would lead, his broad, stooped shoulders already set with the burden of the day. His bare feet, if it was warm enough, would press into the cool, damp earth, feeling every root, every stone, every uneven clod of soil. These feet were not pampered, they were tools, hardened by a lifetime of constant contact with the land. They were calloused, perhaps scarred, but immensely sensitive, providing a direct, unfiltered connection to the ground he was about to till. In colder weather, his simple leather turn shoes, often worn and ill-fitting, would offer a modicum of protection, but little in the way of true comfort. Ilara would follow, perhaps carrying a small sack containing their midday meal, more gruel or a piece of stale bread. Her gait was steady, accustomed to balancing burdens while navigating the treacherous ground. The children, nimble and less burdened, might dart ahead, their youthful energy still unblunted by the day's demands. They would observe the world around them with sharp, unjaded eyes, the dew-laden spiderwebs glistening like forgotten jewels, the flight of a bird, the faint tracks of a night creature in the mud. The air would be crisp, carrying the scent of damp soil, growing things, and the lingering wood smoke from 100 peasant hearths. There was a profound quietude to this commute, a stark contrast to the cacophony of modern travel. It was a time for observation, for a slow, almost unconscious immersion in the natural world that was their workplace. This walk was not just a physical journey, it was a transition, a mental shift from the intimate confines of the hovel to the vast, demanding stage of the common fields. These fields, often laid out in long, narrow strips, were the lifeblood of the village. They stretched as far as the eye could see, a patchwork quilt of green shoots, dark tilled earth and fallow ground. Each strip belonged to a different family, assigned by the lord or determined by ancient custom, but all were worked collectively in the rhythm of the seasons. As they walked, Thomas might scan the horizon, his experienced eye assessing the sky for signs of weather, the moisture in the soil beneath his feet for clues about the day's plowing. Ilara might note the progress of neighboring crops or the state of the communal grazing lands. Every observation was practical, every detail relevant to their survival. There was no abstract thought or idle musing. Their minds were sharply focused on the immediate, tangible realities of their agricultural existence. This walk could vary in length. For those whose strips of land lay closer to the village, it might be a relatively short walk. But for others whose plots were further afield, it could take a significant portion of the morning, especially if they had to traverse marshy ground or navigate around thorny thickets. Time was precious, yet this walk was an unavoidable prelude to the day's work.
The gentle art of plowing, a meditation in mud and sweat. Having walked the worn paths from their hovels past the nascent greens of spring or the stubble of autumn, Thomas and his fellow villagers would arrive at the expansive common fields. Here, under the vast, indifferent sky, the true back-breaking poetry of their existence would unfold, the plowing. This was not merely an agricultural task, it was an ancient dance with the earth, a primal act of transformation, a meditation in mud and sweat that defined the very rhythm of their lives. It was slow, arduous, and utterly essential. Imagine Thomas standing at the head of his allocated strip of land, a long, narrow ribbon of earth stretching towards the horizon. Beside him, tethered to a rudimentary wooden ard or plow, might be a team of oxen, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. Horses, while faster, were expensive to feed and maintain, often reserved for wealthier lords or specialized tasks. The oxen, slow and deliberate, were the peasants' powerhouse, their immense strength harnessed to break and turn the unyielding soil. The plow itself was a simple, yet profoundly effective tool. The most common was the ard, or scratch plow, which merely scratched a furrow in the soil, suitable for lighter, drier earth. In heavier, wetter soils, a more advanced moldboard plow might be used, designed to cut a deeper furrow and turn the soil over, burying weeds and aerating the earth. But regardless of its specific design, it was a heavy, cumbersome implement, requiring immense physical effort to guide.
Thomas would grasp the wooden handles, his calloused hands fitting perfectly to the worn wood, shaped by generations of use. The oxen would shift, their heavy hooves sinking slightly into the damp ground. With a grunt, Thomas would lean into the plow, urging the animals forward with a quiet word or a gentle prod, and then the work would begin. The plowshare, an iron tip or a sharpened piece of hardened wood, would bite into the earth. There would be a tearing sound, a deep, resonant rumble as the soil yielded, slowly, grudgingly, before the relentless pressure. A rich, earthy scent would rise, the smell of damp soil, of decaying organic matter, of the very essence of life. This was the perfume of their world, the scent of sustenance. The pace was excruciatingly slow. Each step of the oxen, each footfall of Thomas was measured and deliberate. The furrow would slowly, incrementally extend behind them, a dark, moist line carving its way across the field. Plowing was not a task that allowed for haste. It demanded patience, strength, and almost an intimate understanding of the land. Thomas had to feel the resistance of the soil, adjust the angle of the plow, guide the oxen with subtle cues, ensuring the furrow was straight, even, and deep enough. This was not solitary labor. Though each family had its own strips, the fields were communal, and other peasants would be engaged in the same timeless task nearby. The sounds of their efforts would carry on the breeze, the grunts of other oxen, the low shouts of their owners, the rhythmic tearing of earth. There was a shared understanding, a silent camaraderie born of identical toil. They were all bound by the same demands of the soil, the same cycles of nature. Hours would pass, marked only by the shifting position of the sun. The early morning chill would give way to the warmth of the day, and then, inevitably, to the burning heat. Sweat would begin to bead on Thomas's brow, trickling down his face, soaking into his coarse tunic. His muscles would ache, a deep, pervasive weariness that settled into his bones, but he would not stop. He could not. The work had to be done. The family depended on it, the village depended on it, their very survival hinged on the meticulous preparation of this earth. There was a meditative quality to the repetitive nature of plowing. The rhythmic crunch of the plow, the steady pace of the oxen, the endless turning of the soil. It allowed the mind to settle into a trance-like state. Thoughts might drift, but the body remained focused, performing the learned motions with an unconscious grace. It was a physical and mental endurance test, a test they faced every spring and autumn. Accidents were a constant risk. The plow could strike a hidden stone, sending a jolt up Thomas's arms. An ox could stumble, a harness could break. The ground itself was unforgiving. Yet they worked with an inherent caution, born of generations of experience, understanding that a single injury could spell disaster for their family. There was no safety net, no disability pay. A broken leg, a deep cut, could mean starvation. By midday, a significant portion of the strip might be plowed. Looking back at the dark, turned earth, a sense of accomplishment, however fleeting, might touch Thomas. This was visible progress, tangible proof of his labor. It was a transformation, the bringing forth of potential from the raw, dormant soil. And as the sun reached its zenith, signaling a brief respite, Thomas would unharness his oxen, wipe the sweat from his brow, and prepare for the meager lunch that awaited him. A short pause before the patient, muscle-straining dance with the earth began anew. This was the peasant's art, ancient and essential, a silent dedication to the mud and sweat that built their world. Lord and serf, a relationship built on taxes. Beyond the back-breaking labor in the communal fields, beyond the simple walls of their hovels, lay a profound and inescapable reality for the medieval peasant, their relationship with the Lord. This was not a voluntary association, nor a partnership of equals. It was a hierarchical bond,
a complex web of duties and obligations, of protection and exploitation, upon which the entire feudal system was built. At its heart, it was a relationship built on taxes, extracted not just in coin, but in labor, in goods, and in the very essence of their freedom. The lord, a distant, often unseen figure, residing in his fortified manor house or castle, a stark contrast to the humble peasant dwellings, was the owner of the land, the ultimate authority, granted his power by the king or a higher noble. The peasant, often serf, meaning they were tied to the land, not truly free to leave, was a fundamental component of the lord's wealth and power. In exchange for the right to live on the land, to cultivate their strips in the common fields, and to receive a modicum of protection, the peasant owed a significant portion of their life's output to their lord. This was the silent, ever-present weight on their shoulders, the core injustice of their existence. But the taxes extended far beyond mere grain. There was labor service, known as corvée. Thomas, for instance, might be required to spend a certain number of days each week or a specific number of weeks each year working directly on the lord's domain, the lord's own private lands. This work was often the most arduous and urgent, occurring during peak seasons like plowing or harvest, when his own crops desperately needed his attention. Yet the lord's fields took precedence. This was free labor, directly benefiting the lord and reducing the time and energy the peasant could devote to his family survival. There were also a myriad of smaller yet equally burdensome fees and fines. The banilities were a particularly galling set of monopolies. Peasants were often forbidden to grind their own grain or bake their own bread. Instead, they were compelled to use the lord's mill and the lord's oven, for which they had to pay a fee, often another portion of their precious grain or flour. The lord's wine press, the lord's forge, all communal services that were once free might become subject to a charge, ensuring the lord profited from every essential aspect of peasant life. Marriage, too, could be a source of revenue for the lord. If a serf wished to marry someone from outside the manor, or if their child wished to do so, a merchant fee might be levied, essentially a payment for the loss of a potential laborer or for the right to move away. Inheritance also came with a price. Upon the death of a peasant, a heriot might be demanded, often the best beast or a valuable possession, further depleting the family's meager assets. Justice, too, was controlled by the lord. His manorial court was where disputes were settled, petty crimes judged and fines levied. While it offered a form of order and conflict resolution, it was fundamentally biased. The lord was the judge, jury, and beneficiary of the fines, creating an inherent incentive to find fault and extract payment. For the peasant, recourse against the lord's decrees was virtually non-existent. This relationship was often enforced by the bailiff or reeve, the lord's overseer, who walked among them, watching, assessing, and ensuring that all obligations were met. Their presence was a constant reminder of the lord's power, a chilling shadow over every aspect of the peasant's day. Resistance was futile and dangerous, often met with severe punishment, for their very existence was predicated on the lord's allowance. Yet, there was also a paradoxical element of protection.
Lunch in the dirt, midday meals on the edge of exhaustion. As the sun climbed higher, relentless in its journey across the sky, casting shorter and sharper shadows, the rhythm of plowing or planting in the open fields would reach its midpoint. For the modern worker, midday might bring the promise of a warm meal in a comfortable setting, perhaps a brief escape from the demands of the day. For the medieval peasant, however, lunch was not a reprieve, but merely a necessary pause, a brief, unscheduled refueling taken directly amidst the dirt and demands of their workspace, often on the very edge of physical exhaustion. Imagine Thomas, wiping sweat from his brow with a forearm grimed with soil, the heavy plow lying still in a half-turned furrow. His oxen, too, would stand with lowered heads, their immense bodies steaming faintly. The morning's labor had already taken its toll.
Muscles ached, backs were stiff, and the deep, gnawing hunger that had been temporarily sated by the morning gruel was now an insistent throb. There was no village bell to signal the midday break, no communal feast. The sun itself, reaching its zenith, was the only clock they needed. Ilara, if she was working alongside him, would also pause, perhaps having spent the morning weeding, gathering brushwood, or spinning thread while tending to the younger children. The midday meal was rarely, if ever, a hot one. There was no fire in the field, no way to cook. What they ate was what they brought with them from the hovel, often a piece of stale bread, hardened by exposure to the air, or a lump of cold, congealed gruel wrapped in a cloth. Sometimes, if they were fortunate and the season allowed, a piece of cheese, a few foraged nuts, or some dried fruit might accompany the bread. They would find a spot, perhaps under the sparse shade of a solitary tree at the edge of the field, or simply wherever they stood. There were no tables or chairs, no soft ground. They would squat or sit directly on the hard, uneven earth, or perhaps on a discarded log or stone. The ground beneath them was still the same earth they toiled, imbued with the scent of their labor. Every mouthful of food would be eaten with hands that were rough and soiled, the taste of the land itself mingled with their sustenance. The act of eating was swift and largely silent. Conversation, if any, would be brief and functional. A comment on the weather, the progress of a neighbor's crops, or a plan for the afternoon's tasks. There was no time for idle chatter, no energy to spare for light-heartedness. Every chew, every swallow was a conscious effort to restore depleted energy, to prepare for the long hours of work that still stretched before them. The food, bland as it was a lifeline, a bridge between the exhaustion of the morning and the renewed effort of the afternoon. Water, carried in a simple leather or earthenware flask, would be passed around, each sip precious, carefully rationed to last the entire day. The sun would beat down, the air would shimmer over the fields, and the sounds of distant work or the buzzing of insects would fill the short silence. This brief interlude was not a moment of true rest, but rather a temporary halt in the relentless physical demands. Their bodies were still tense, their minds still attuned to the demands of the soil. Children, too, participated in this midday pause. They would share in the same meager rations, their young bodies equally in need of fuel for their chores, whether it was scaring birds from the crops, fetching water, or carrying messages. From an early age, they understood the direct correlation between food and energy, between eating and the ability to continue working. There was no concept of snacks or treats. Every calorie had a purpose. For the medieval peasant, lunch was a stark reminder of their daily struggle. It highlighted the scarcity of resources, the unyielding nature of their labor, and the ever-present proximity of hunger. There was no pretense, no attempt to make the meal anything more than it was. Raw fuel for raw toil. It was a testament to their resilience, their ability to find sustenance and continue even when faced with the simplest, most monotonous fare. As the last crumbs were consumed and the last drops of water drunk, a collective sigh might escape them, a silent acknowledgement of the weariness that clung to their bones. There was no leisurely contemplation, no prolonged enjoyment. The brief respite was over. The sun was still high, the fields still beckoned, and the day's work was far from done. With a renewed, albeit fleeting surge of energy, Thomas would rise, pick up the plow handles, and guide his oxen back into the furrow. Ilara would return to her weeding. The silent, arduous rhythm of the afternoon would begin, a relentless march towards dusk, fueled by the memory of a few mouthfuls of bread and the unwavering will to survive. Lunch in the dirt, on the edge of exhaustion, was simply another unbreakable thread in the fabric of their enduring medieval life. Feast days were still work days, holy days of partial rest. In the relentless grind of the medieval peasant's life, where dawn to dusk labor was the unyielding norm, the concept of a day of rest might seem a cherished, almost mythical ideal. And yet the Christian calendar, interwoven deeply with the fabric of their existence, offered moments of respite, the feast days. These holy days, commemorating saints or significant religious events, were indeed marked by a cessation of the most arduous field labor. But to imagine them as days of pure leisure, as we might conceive of a modern weekend, would be a profound misreading of the peasant's reality. For even on these sacred occasions, work, in its myriad forms, still defined their hours, transforming holy days into holy days of partial rest. Imagine the quiet anticipation that might ripple through the village on the eve of a major feast. The sun, setting over the fields that had consumed their week, would signal a brief, almost palpable easing of the physical burden. The heavy plow would be left in its furrow, the scythe laid aside. For Thomas and Elora, this meant their hands for a few precious hours would be spared the raw abrasion of soil and tool. This was the first, most tangible blessing of a feast day, a temporary suspension of the relentless back-breaking toil that defined their daily bread. Yet the cessation of fieldwork did not equate to idleness. The peasant household was a self-sustaining unit, and its myriad demands did not vanish with the rising of a religious sun. The animals, oblivious to holy observances, still needed feeding, milking, and tending. The cows would low for their morning milk, the chickens would scratch for their feed, the pigs would grunt their demands. Ilara would still rise at dawn, perhaps a fraction later than usual, to manage these essential chores. The fire and the hearth still needed tending, water still had to be fetched from the well, and the ever-present task of mending clothes, repairing tools, or preparing simple meals continued. For women especially, the rest of a feast day was often illusory. While men might be free from the plow, women's domestic duties were continuous. Spinning wool into thread, weaving cloth on a small loom, grinding grain if they had their own hand mill, though this was often restricted by the Lord's banalities, preparing what meager food they possessed. These were ceaseless tasks that acknowledged no holy day. Perhaps a little less vigorously, perhaps with more conversation, but the work nonetheless persisted. It was a quieter work, perhaps, but work nonetheless. The central feature of any feast day was, of course, the attendance to church. This was not merely an option, it was a deeply ingrained obligation, both spiritual and social. The entire village, clad in their slightly better, less soiled garments, perhaps a cleaner tunic or a carefully preserved mantle, would make their way to the modest village church. This building, often the most substantial structure in the village, stood as a stark reminder of the church's pervasive influence, a towering presence of stone and timber amidst their humble hovels. The Mass itself, conducted in Latin, would have been largely incomprehensible to most peasants who spoke only their local vernacular. Yet the experience was profound and visceral. The scent of incense, the flickering glow of candles, the solemn chants of the priest, the vivid imagery of painted saints and crucifixes, these elements created an immersive, sensory spectacle. It was a world away from the mud and sweat of the fields, a glimpse into a higher realm, offering solace and meaning to lives often characterized by hardship. For a few hours, they were part of something larger, a universal community of believers. The church also served as a vital social hub. After Mass, before returning to their various tasks, peasants might linger in the churchyard. This was a rare opportunity for communal interaction beyond the immediate family or work group. News would be exchanged, births, deaths, marriages, the latest gossip about the Lord or a neighboring village. Simple games might be played by the children, and perhaps
As the sun began its slow, deliberate descent towards the western horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and fading gold. A new rhythm would assert itself across the medieval landscape. The arduous, sun-soaked hours in the fields would finally yield to the promise of home. For Thomas, Ilara, and every other peasant in the village, the journey back was not merely a physical return, but a transition from the vast, demanding stage of outdoor labor to the intimate, smoky embrace of their hovels, and the collective, comforting hum of the village at dusk. Imagine the lengthening shadows stretching across the freshly tilled furrows or the ripening crops. The tools, heavy and cold in their hands, would be laid down for the day. The oxen, unyoked and released, would slowly lumber towards their meager pastures or rudimentary pens. The weariness that had settled deep into Thomas's bones throughout the day would now intensify, a heavy cloak of fatigue that promised the welcome oblivion of sleep. Yet there was also a quiet satisfaction, the primal contentment of a day's labor completed, of another battle won against the unyielding demands of survival. The walk back to the village was a reversal of the morning's commute, but with a different atmosphere. The morning had been about anticipation, about gearing up for the demands ahead. The evening walk was about winding down, about shedding the burdens of the day, even if only momentarily. The air, losing its midday heat, would grow cooler, carrying the faint, earthy scent of the fields, mingled with the emerging smell of wood smoke from 100 rekindled hearths. The sounds, too, would shift from the scattered grunts of labor to the lowing of returning cattle, the distant bleating of sheep, and the first tentative calls of evening birds. As they neared the cluster of thatched roofs, the distinct shape of their village would emerge from the fading light. It was a familiar sight, ingrained in their very being, a huddle of dark shapes against the darkening sky, a beacon of human presence in the vastness of the natural world. Smoke plumes, thin and gray, would rise from each chimney hole, silent affirmations of life, of warmth, of the promise of a meal. This collective exhale of smoke was the village breathing, exhaling the day's work and preparing for the night's rest. Children, who might have spent the day on smaller chores or tending to younger siblings, would often gather at the village edge, eagerly awaiting the return of their parents. Their youthful energy, though perhaps dampened by their own duties, still outstripped the deep weariness of the adults. The quiet greetings exchanged between returning laborers, a nod, a brief word, spoke volumes of shared experience, of mutual understanding born of identical hardship. Entering the hovel, Thomas and Ilara would be met with the familiar warmth of their rekindled hearth, perhaps tended by an older child or a grandparent. The single room, which had felt cold and empty in the morning, now seemed to embrace them, a cocoon of smoky warmth and the faint, familiar odors of their existence. It was a space that offered no luxury, but profound security, a shelter from the wildness beyond its fragile walls. The first tasks upon returning home were essential and immediate. Water from the communal well needed to be replenished, wood gathered and brought in for the evening fire, and any animals still outside the hovel secured. If they had a small garden plot, Ilara might spend a few minutes harvesting a handful of greens or root vegetables for the evening meal. Every resource was precious, every opportunity for sustenance utilized. As dusk deepened into twilight, the sounds of the village would become more pronounced. The chatter of neighbors, the distant cries of infants, the clucking of chickens settling for the night, the occasional bark of a dog. These were the comforting sounds of the community winding down. From within their own hovel, Thomas and Ilara would hear these echoes, a gentle affirmation of their interconnectedness, of being part of a larger whole that faced the same challenges and shared the same humble victories. The evening light, provided only by the flickering fire and perhaps a single rushlight, a simple wick soaked in animal fat, would create a world of dancing shadows. The contours of their cramped home would soften, lending a deceptive intimacy to the rough walls and earthen floor. It was a time for simple preparation, for quiet anticipation of the evening meal, which, though plain, represented the culmination of their daily efforts. For the medieval peasant, home was not a place of leisure, but a functional space,
a refuge, and the center of their family's survival. It was where life was lived in its most unvarnished form, where generations huddled together for warmth and security, and where the constant cycle of work and rest played out under the watchful eye of the stars. The village at dusk, smoky and murmuring, was a powerful tableau of endurance, a testament to the resilience of a people living in profound harmony with the unforgiving rhythms of their world, preparing themselves for another dawn, another sunrise, and the endless return to the fields. Dinner by firelight. One bowl, many hands. As the last vestiges of twilight faded from the narrow smoke hole of the hovel, and the village outside settled into the murmuring quiet of night, the peasant family would turn their attention to the evening meal. Dinner, unlike the hurried breakfast or the fieldside lunch, was the anchor of their day, a moment of communal gathering and shared sustenance. Yet it was a meal stripped to its most fundamental elements, eaten by the flickering, dancing light of the hearth, often from a single communal bowl passed among many hands, a poignant testament to both their scarcity and their unbreakable family bonds. Imagine the intimate glow of the fire, the only significant light source within the small smoky room. It cast long, wavering shadows on the rough-hewn walls, making familiar objects seem to shift and dance. The air, heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the simmering contents of the pot, was also thick with the accumulated odors of a day spent in the fields and with animals. This was their evening ambience, a raw, primal setting for the most important meal of their day. The centerpiece of dinner was almost always a thick, hearty pottage. This was the evening equivalent of gruel, but often more substantial, a slow-cooked stew made from whatever was available. More grains, barley, oats, rye, perhaps some dried peas or beans, and any seasonal vegetables from their small garden plot. Cabbages, onions, leeks, turnips. Meat was a rarity, a precious addition only on feast days or when hunting yielded a small animal. If they were fortunate, a bit of salted lard or bacon might be added for flavor and fat. Ilara, or perhaps an older child under her supervision, would have spent the late afternoon tending this pottage over the fire, ensuring it was cooked slowly, allowing the flavors to meld and the ingredients to soften. There was no rush. The evening meal was prepared with a quiet patience, an understanding that this sustenance was critical for the strength needed for the following day. When the pottage was deemed ready, the family would gather around the hearth. There was no formal dining table, certainly not one large enough for everyone. Instead, they would squat on the packed earth floor or perch on low stools, their bodies pressed together, finding warmth and closeness in the confined space. The pottage would be served not into individual plates, but often into a single large wooden bowl placed in the center. This communal vessel was a practical solution born of limited possessions and a desire for efficiency. Each family member, from Thomas and Ilara to the youngest child capable of holding a spoon or a piece of bread, would dip into the shared bowl. The unspoken rules of this communal eating were understood from infancy. No greed, no pushing, only a fair, albeit rapid, consumption. Hands, still rough and work-worn, would deftly scoop or hold a piece of stale bread, using it to sop up the thick stew. The sounds of eating were simple: the clatter of wooden spoons against the bowl, the slurping of the pottage, the soft chewing. Conversation during dinner was often muted, or focused on the practicalities of the day and the plans for tomorrow. There was no television, no distractions. The flickering firelight cast an intimate glow, highlighting faces etched with the day's toil, yet softened by the shared ritual. It was a moment of quiet connection, of familial presence, even if words were few. The very act of eating from a single bowl underscored their collective fate, their shared struggle, and their mutual dependence. Sometimes a few bits of hard, dark bread, made from their coarsest grains, would accompany the pottage. This bread was a staple, often baked only once a week in the communal oven, if the Lord permitted, and would have grown stale and hard over the days. Yet it served as a vital scoop, a source of additional calories, and a palate cleanser for the monotonous pottage. The nutritional intake from this meal, combined with their breakfast gruel and meager lunch, often hovered at the edge of sufficiency. They consumed vast quantities of carbohydrates, essential for their physically demanding lives. Protein, however, remained scarce, and vitamins from fresh produce were highly seasonal. This constant dietary stress contributed to their weariness, their susceptibility to illness, and their often shorter lifespans. Yet it was enough to keep them going, enough to fuel another day's labor. As the pottage was consumed and the communal bowl was emptied, a final sense of satiety, however brief, would settle over the family. The hunger for a few hours would be stilled.
Fireside storytelling, memory, myth, and local gossip. With the last remnants of the pottage scraped from the communal bowl and the evening chill beginning to seep through the thin walls of the hovel, the peasant family would settle into the profound intimacy of the flickering firelight. In a world devoid of printed books, of widespread literacy, of artificial light that extended the day, this was the hour of oral tradition. This was the time for fireside storytelling, where the lines between memory, ancient myth, and the freshest local gossip blurred, weaving a rich tapestry of shared experience and cultural preservation. Imagine the faces, softened by the dancing shadows, gathered closely around the hearth. Thomas, Ilara, their children, perhaps a grandparent, all united in the warm embrace of the fire's glow. The air would be thick with the comforting scent of wood smoke, mingling with the subtle odors of their shared lives. The sounds outside, the distant howl of a wolf, the rustle of wind in the thatch, would only serve to heighten the sense of cozy confinement within their meager dwelling. The stories themselves were not formal narratives, but fluid, organic expressions of their world. They might begin with an elder recounting a tale passed down through generations, the exploits of a legendary local hero, a cautionary tale about the mischievous fey folk lurking in the nearby woods, or a parable from the lives of saints. These ancient myths were not seen as mere fiction. They were woven into the very fabric of their understanding of the world, explaining the inexplicable, reinforcing moral codes, and providing a sense of continuity with their ancestors. Each telling was a subtle act of cultural preservation, ensuring that the collective memory of the village endured. Then there were the historical memories, the stories of events that shaped their immediate past, a particularly harsh winter, a bountiful harvest, a fire that devastated a neighboring village, the visit of a distant lord or bishop. These were the chronicles of their local world, shared to teach, to warn, and to simply remember. Grandparents, with their vast store of accumulated experiences, were the living libraries of the village, their voices the conduits through which history, both grand and minute, flowed into the present. But perhaps the most immediate and engaging form of storytelling was the local gossip. In a tightly knit, insular community, news traveled by word of mouth, carried on the breeze and amplified by speculation. Who married whom? Who was ill? Whose cow had wandered off? The latest pronouncements from the Lord's bailiff? A quarrel between neighbors? These were the daily dramas that shaped their social landscape. The telling of gossip was not always malicious. It was often a way of understanding the social dynamics, of reinforcing community norms, and of simply keeping abreast of the small, vital events that affected everyone. The act of listening was as important as the act of telling. Children, their eyes wide in the firelight, would absorb these narratives, learning not only the facts, but also the inflections, the unspoken lessons, the nuances of their cultural heritage. This was their education, far removed from any formal schooling. They learned about their community, their history, their beliefs, and the unspoken rules of their society. They learned fear and wonder, caution and hope, all through the power of the spoken word. The storytelling was not a performance in the modern sense. It was interactive, fluid. Listeners might interject with their own recollections, add details, or ask questions. The stories would twist and turn, adapting to the mood of the evening, shaping themselves around the collective experiences of those present.
The silences between tales were as potent as the words themselves, filled with the warmth of shared presence, the crackle of the fire, and the gentle breathing of sleeping children. There was a profound sense of human connection forged in these moments. In a world of scarcity and hardship, where outward expressions of affection might be rare, the sharing of stories was an intimate act. It brought them closer, reinforcing the bonds of family and community. It allowed them to transcend, if only for a brief time, the relentless physical demands of their day, lifting their minds into realms of imagination, memory, and shared understanding. As the fire began to die down, casting longer, fainter shadows, the stories would gradually cease. Voices would grow softer, then fall silent. The sheer weariness of the day would assert its claim, pulling tired bodies towards the straw bedding. The last glow of the embers would illuminate faces heavy with sleep, minds now drifting from myth and memory into the uncharted territories of dreams. Fireside storytelling was the peasants' nightly balm, a vital sustenance for the spirit, a quiet, profound reaffirmation of their humanity in a world that often demanded nothing but their labor. It was a beautiful, enduring tradition, weaving the past into the present and preparing them, in their dreams, for the inevitable return of the rooster's call. Bedtime in a straw nest, sleeping together literally. As the final embers of the hearth pulsed with a diminishing glow, casting last faint shadows across the hovel's rough walls, the deepest weariness of the day would assert its undeniable claim. For the medieval peasant family, the transition from the communal warmth of fireside storytelling to the embrace of sleep was a swift, unceremonious affair. There was no concept of individual bedrooms, no private spaces for rest. Instead, they would retreat to a shared, communal sleeping arrangement, a large, often single, straw nest where the entire family huddled together, literally, for warmth, security, and the simple oblivion of exhaustion. Imagine the sleeping arrangements within that cramped, single room. In one corner or along one wall would be a raised platform, or simply a designated area on the earthen floor, covered with a thick layer of straw. This was their bed, their collective haven. The straw, coarse and rustling, might be replaced periodically, but it was the material of comfort, absorbing the dampness and offering a modicum of insulation from the cold earth. Over this, a few simple, rough woolen blankets or animal hides would provide covering. There was no undressing in the modern sense. Many peasants, especially during colder months, would sleep in their undergarments or even in the same clothes they wore during the day, simply removing outer tunics or cloaks. The concept of nightly bathing was a luxury almost unknown, and certainly not a daily ritual. The smells of their day, of sweat, of smoke, of the animals, would cling to their garments and mingle in the close confines of their shared sleeping space. Thomas and Alara, their bodies aching from a day of incessant labor, would be the first to settle. The children, their youthful energy finally depleted, would soon follow. They would lie down together, side by side, a tangle of limbs, seeking warmth from each other's bodies. This physical proximity was not a choice, but a necessity, a practical strategy for survival in unheated or poorly heated dwellings. Body heat was a precious commodity, shared and relied upon to ward off the biting cold of the night, especially during the long, brutal winter months. The sounds of the hovel at bedtime were intimate and primal. The soft rustle of straw as someone shifted, the gentle breathing of sleeping children, the occasional cough, perhaps the snuffling of a dog or a cat that might share their shelter. Outside, the village would be cloaked in profound silence, broken only by the hoot of an owl, the rustle of wind in the thatch. This quietude allowed the deeper sounds of the family and the natural world to fill the space. Privacy as we define it simply did not exist. Every aspect of life, from waking to sleeping, was a shared communal experience. There was no expectation of personal space, no individual retreat. This constant proximity fostered a unique kind of intimacy, a deep, unspoken understanding born of always being together, always sensing each other's presence. For children, it meant growing up with the constant reassuring presence of their parents and siblings, learning the rhythms of family life through continuous observation. This was their education, far removed from any formal schooling. They learned about their community, their history, their beliefs, and the unspoken rules of their society. They learned fear and wonder, caution and hope, all through the power of the spoken word.
Dreaming in Latin, religion as structure and solace. As the medieval peasant family slipped into the deep restorative sleep born of utter exhaustion, their waking lives may have been dominated by the tangible realities of earth and toil, but their dreams, both conscious and unconscious, were often shaped by a pervasive, intangible force, the Church. In an age before widespread literacy, before modern science, religion was not merely a belief system. It was the fundamental structure of their world, the source of meaning, the ultimate authority, and, often, the only true solace in a life defined by hardship. Their very worldview, even their dreams, were, in a sense, whispered in Latin. Imagine the peasant's understanding of the cosmos. It was not derived from books or scientific inquiry, but from the teachings of the local priest, interpreted through sermons, stained glass, and the vivid imagery of saints and devils. The world was a flat disk, with Jerusalem at its center, surrounded by the known lands and the unknown, perilous edges. Above them lay heaven, a realm of ultimate reward for the righteous. Below, the terrifying fires of hell, the eternal punishment for the wicked. Every natural disaster, every illness, every stroke of good or ill fortune was interpreted through this divine lens, a sign of God's favor, or His wrath, or a test of their faith. The church calendar dictated the rhythm of their year, even more than the agricultural seasons. Sundays were days of mandatory rest and worship, as were numerous feast days commemorating saints, the Virgin Mary, or key events in the life of Christ. These days provided the only sanctioned breaks from manual labor, punctuating the relentless toil with moments of communal prayer and spiritual reflection. Even if the Latin of the Mass was largely intelligible, the rituals, the incense, the candles, the solemnity provided a powerful sensory experience that reinforced the omnipresence of the divine. The priest, often the only literate person in the village, was a figure of immense authority, second only to the Lord. He was the spiritual guide, the interpreter of God's will, the keeper of sacred knowledge. He performed the sacraments, baptism, marriage, confession, last rites, which marked the crucial passages of every peasant's life from cradle to grave. He was the intermediary between the earthly realm and the divine, holding the keys to salvation. His word was often law, enforced not only by earthly punishment, but by the terrifying prospect of eternal damnation. Confession was a regular, vital act. Peasants, burdened by their sins, a moment of anger, a dishonest thought, a failure to observe a fast, would seek absolution from the priest. This provided a psychological release, a purification, and a reintegration into the moral order. It also reinforced the Church's power, as the priest held the ultimate authority to grant or withhold forgiveness. The fear of damnation was a potent motivator, shaping behavior, encouraging obedience, and instilling a profound sense of sinfulness that permeated their daily lives. Pilgrimages, though often beyond the reach of the poorest, represented a profound spiritual aspiration. For those who could afford the time and expense, a journey to a local shrine or a distant holy site was a chance for spiritual merit, for miraculous healing, or for absolution from particularly grievous sins. These journeys, arduous and often dangerous, were undertaken with immense faith, a testament to the depth of their religious conviction. The Church also provided a form of rudimentary social welfare. Monasteries and convents, scattered across the landscape, offered charity to the poor, refuge to travelers, and sometimes even a basic education to a select few.
Though limited, these services represented a safety net that existed outside the direct control of the Lord, offering a glimmer of hope and assistance in a world otherwise characterized by stark self-reliance. Perhaps most importantly, religion offered solace. In a life beset by poverty, disease, famine, and the constant threat of violence, the promise of an afterlife in heaven was a powerful balm. This earthly existence, with all of its suffering, was merely a temporary test, a prelude to eternal reward. This belief instilled a profound patience, a quiet endurance, and a deep-seated acceptance of their lot. Misery on earth was not pointless, it was a path to salvation. The suffering they endured was seen as a way of sharing in Christ's own suffering, a means to earn their place in paradise. Even in their dreams, the imagery of the church might intrude. Visions of angels, of saints, of the Virgin Mary, or, conversely, terrifying nightmares of demons and the fires of hell would be interpreted as divine messages or warnings. Their waking reality was so deeply saturated with religious teachings that it permeated their subconscious, shaping their fears and their hopes. For the medieval peasant, the church was not an optional Sunday activity. It was the very air they breathed, the lens through which they understood existence, and the framework that gave their arduous lives meaning. It was a comforting, terrifying, and all-encompassing presence, speaking to them in a language of symbols and rituals, guiding them through a world they barely comprehended, and offering them, above all else, the profound, enduring solace of salvation. Pets, pests, and companions. Fleas, rats, and chickens indoors. In the close and cramped confines of the medieval peasant hovel, the human inhabitants were rarely alone. The very nature of their humble dwelling, designed for maximum utility and warmth, meant a constant, often uninvited cohabitation with a vibrant, bustling ecosystem of creatures. From the ever-present, insidious pests that tormented their bodies, to the scurrying rodents that challenged their meager food stores, to the essential livestock that shared their very living space, the peasant's home was a microcosm of the natural world, a continuous, intimate intertwining of human and animal life. Imagine stepping into Thomas and Alara's single-room dwelling. While our modern sensibilities demand sterile separation from the animal kingdom, for them it was an accepted, unavoidable reality. First and foremost, there were the pests. Fleas and lice were an omnipresent torment. They infested clothing, bedding, and hair, their incessant itching a minor but constant irritation in a life filled with greater hardships. There was no effective means of eradication, only temporary relief through scratching or attempting to pick them off. Their presence was simply part of the fabric of everyday life, a tiny, biting reminder of their inescapable connection to the earth and its raw elements. Beyond the skin-crawling microscopic, there were the larger, more destructive pests, rats and mice. These ubiquitous rodents were the bane of every peasant household, a constant threat to their precious food stores. They gnawed through wooden chests, burrowed into sacks of grain, and contaminated what little sustenance the family possessed. Their nocturnal scurrying and gnawing sounds were a common soundtrack to the peasant's sleep, a chilling reminder of the battle waged against these persistent invaders. While traps might be set, and cats, when available, were highly valued, the war against rodents was an endless skirmish, often lost by attrition. Yet not all animal inhabitants were pests. Many were companions, albeit a highly utilitarian nature. Dogs, though perhaps not the pampered pets we know today, were invaluable members of the household. They served as guard animals, alerting the family to strangers or wild beasts, and sometimes as working animals, helping to herd sheep or hunt small game. They shared the warmth of the fire, devoured scraps, and offered a rudimentary form of companionship in a harsh world. Their loyalty, however, was often repaid with minimal care, a reflection of the pragmatic approach to all resources. Cats, while less common than dogs, were highly prized for their ability to hunt rats and mice. A good mouser was a valuable asset,
protecting the family's food supply. They too would share the hearth, offering a quiet, independent presence, a purring counterpoint to the endless toil. Perhaps most surprisingly, indoor companions, from a modern perspective, were the livestock. It was not uncommon for smaller animals like chickens or even a young piglet to share the single living space with the human family, particularly during the colder months. This might seem unsanitary and uncomfortable to us, but it served multiple crucial purposes. The animals provided additional warmth. Their body heat contributed to the meager temperature of the hovel. They were also protected from predators and theft, invaluable assets that could not be left exposed outdoors. Imagine the clucking of chickens in a corner, the occasional grunts of a piglet rooting near the door, the faint but ever-present animal smells mingling with the wood smoke and human odors. The floor, as previously noted, was packed earth, making cleaning a rudimentary affair. Animal waste would be swept out, but a certain level of grime and dampness was unavoidable. This constant cohabitation meant that the peasant's life was deeply integrated with the animal world, blurring the lines between domestic space and farmyard. The presence of animals, whether
Beyond the confines of the individual hovel, the medieval peasant's world was inextricably woven into the fabric of the village. This was more than just a collection of dwellings. It was a living, breathing organism, a tightly knit social network where every individual's fortunes were intimately linked to their neighbors. In an age before mass communication, before formal record-keeping for the common folk, the flow of information was entirely oral, carried on the wind, whispered over fences, and shouted across fields. This was the village network, a vibrant, continuous exchange of gossip, news of births, deaths, marriages, and even the most mundane, yet vital updates, like dung news. Imagine the village as a series of overlapping circles centered around the church, the communal well, and the fields. Every interaction, however brief, was an opportunity for communication. Women fetching water would linger by the well, exchanging snippets of information. Men working adjacent strips of land would share observations. Children running through the lanes would absorb and transmit stories. There was no escaping the collective gaze, no true privacy. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew everyone's business. Gossip was the lifeblood of this network. Far from being a mere idle pastime, it served as a crucial mechanism for social control and cohesion. Who was courting whom? Who had fallen ill? Whose harvest was struggling? Who had angered the bailiff? These were not just entertaining tales. They reinforced community norms, highlighted potential issues, and allowed for collective judgment or support. A reputation, built and maintained through this oral network, was paramount. A good name could mean aid in times of crisis. A poor one could lead to ostracism. News of births and deaths rippled through the village with a speed that belied the lack of formal channels. A birth was a moment of celebration and hope, a new potential laborer for the family and the community, another soul for the church. Women, particularly, would be involved in the birthing process, sharing knowledge and support. A death, conversely, was a profound loss, not just for the immediate family, but for the entire collective, potentially meaning one less hand for the harvest, one less mouth to feed, or a shift in land ownership. The village would mourn together, attending the simple funeral rites, reinforcing their shared mortality and the sanctity of communal life. Marriages were not merely personal unions. They were strategic alliances, binding families and solidifying landholdings. The negotiations, the dowries, however small, the announcements, all were public knowledge, debated and discussed within the network. These events shaped the future of the village, determining the demographic landscape and the distribution of labor. But the village network also carried more mundane, yet fundamentally important information.
Think of it as the medieval equivalent of social media, but far more localized and tactile. This included dung news, literally, information about who had a good supply of manure for their fields or who was in need. Manure was gold, essential for fertilizing their overworked soil and ensuring a decent harvest. Knowing where to find it or where to offer it was a vital piece of economic intelligence. Beyond the immediate, the network also disseminated information from the outside world, however filtered and delayed. News of the Lord's pronouncements, updates from the manorial court, rumors of distant wars or changes in law, these would arrive through travelers, merchants, or the priest, and then spread rapidly through the village grapevine, often embellished or misinterpreted along the way. These scraps of external information helped the peasants understand, however imperfectly, the larger forces that shaped their lives. The village network was a constant, dynamic hum of communication, a testament to the essential interdependence of peasant life. It fostered a deep sense of belonging, a collective identity. While it lacked the privacy we cherish today, it provided a robust system of mutual support, shared knowledge, and social accountability. It ensured that no one was truly alone in their struggles, and that every significant event, from the most joyful to the most tragic, was a shared experience. In the absence of written records, the oral traditions of the village network served as their history, their news, and their enduring communal bond, knitting together the separate lives into one continuous, resilient tapestry. To our modern minds, saturated with constant novelty, stimulation, and the relentless pursuit of progress, the word monotony often carries a negative connotation, conjuring images of boredom and stagnation. But for the medieval peasant, whose life was an unyielding cycle of repetitive tasks, performed day in and day out, season after season, monotony was not a burden, but a fundamental reality. More profoundly, it was a source of unexpected peace, a quiet joy found in the rhythm of repetition, a deep, almost spiritual connection to the unchanging patterns of their world. Imagine the peasant's day, the same early awakening with the rooster, the same plain gruel for breakfast, the same walk to the same fields, the same arduous tasks, plowing, sowing, weeding, harvesting, repeated endlessly, with minor variations dictated by the seasons. Their tools were unchanged for centuries, their methods passed down through generations. There was little innovation, little deviation from the established way. For us, this might feel stifling, a life devoid of excitement or personal growth. But for Thomas and Ilara, it was simply life. This relentless repetition fostered a profound mastery. The peasant knew their land with an intimacy that few modern individuals can comprehend. They knew every subtle undulation, every patch of stubborn clay, every shaded corner. Their hands were extensions of their tools, performing tasks with an efficiency born of countless hours of practice. The plowing of a furrow, the casting of seeds, the swinging of a scythe, these were not conscious, effortful movements, but ingrained patterns, almost instinctive. This mastery brought a quiet confidence, a sense of competence in a world that offered few other certainties. There was a meditative quality to this monotony. The rhythmic nature of their work, the steady pace of the oxen, the repeated bending and straightening in the fields, the ceaseless turning of a spinning wheel, allowed the mind to settle into a deeper state. Thoughts might drift. Observations might be made of the clouds, the birds, the insects, but the body continued its work, unburdened by the need for complex decision-making. This unforced rhythm could be profoundly calming, a counterpoint to the anxieties of hunger or illness. In a world marked by profound uncertainty, the constant threat of famine, disease, war, or the arbitrary will of the Lord, monotony offered a strange, comforting predictability. The sun would rise, the work would be done, the seasons would turn. This unwavering cycle, though demanding, was also deeply reassuring. It was a testament to the enduring order of the natural world, a cosmic rhythm that mirrored the steadfastness of their own lives. This predictability was a bedrock of psychological stability in an unstable world. The lack of constant new information or entertainment, which we now crave, also meant that the peasants' senses were finely tuned to the subtle shifts in their immediate environment. The precise shade of green of a ripening crop, the subtle change in the scent of the air before a rain, the unique call of a distant bird, these nuances, often overlooked in our hurried lives, were acutely perceived and appreciated. Monotony allowed for a deeper engagement with the small, everyday wonders of their immediate surroundings. Moreover, the repetitive nature of their tasks freed their minds for another form of engagement: social connection. While their hands were busy, their mouths and minds were not necessarily idle. The communal nature of much of their work, whether in the fields or by the hearth, meant that conversation, storytelling, and silent companionship could flourish. The shared rhythm of work fostered a deep bond, a quiet understanding that transcended words. The monotony of their tasks allowed for the richness of human connection to unfold. There was also a profound sense of purpose embedded in this repetition. Every furrow plowed, every seed sown, every thread spun was directly linked to their survival. The monotony was not pointless, it was the very engine of their existence. This direct connection between effort and outcome, however meager, lent dignity to their labor and a clear understanding of their role in the grand scheme of life. For the medieval peasant, the joy of monotony was not a fleeting emotion, but a profound state of being. It was the peace found in repetition, the security in predictability, the quiet satisfaction of mastery over a century.
Narrative reading story. Natural rhythms. Life without clocks. In a world where digital displays constantly flash the precise minute, where schedules dictate every waking hour, and where the relentless tick of the clock governs our existence, it is almost impossible to conceive of a life lived without this ubiquitous measure of time. Yet, for the medieval peasant, the very concept of an abstract, standardized hour or minute was alien. Their lives were not governed by mechanical contrivances, but by the grand, immutable sweep of natural rhythms: the sun, the moon, the stars, the seasons, and the ancient, insistent call of their own bodies. This was life without clocks, a profound immersion in the organic pulse of the earth. Imagine Thomas and Alara's day. It began not with the blare of an alarm, but with the rooster's crow, a living timepiece tied to the rising light. The first glimmers of dawn, slowly painting the eastern sky, signaled the hour to rise. The sun's ascent through the morning sky marked the progression of their fieldwork, the moment for breakfast, the approach of midday, the time for a brief, parched rest. The sun reaching its zenith was their signal for lunch, a silent, blazing indicator of the day's midpoint. Its slow, deliberate descent towards the west commanded their return from the fields, its fading light telling them when to put down their tools. Twilight was the transition, the moment for evening chores and the gathering of the family. Absolute darkness, illuminated only by the fire's glow, was the time for stories and ultimately for sleep. The duration of their workday, therefore, fluctuated dramatically with the seasons. In the long, light-filled days of summer, their labor extended for what we would consider exceptionally long hours, pushing the limits of endurance. In the short, dark days of winter, their active hours were curtailed by necessity, though domestic tasks still filled the restricted light. Their workday was not 8 hours, it was simply from dawn to dusk. Beyond the daily solar cycle, their lives were deeply intertwined with the broader rhythms of the seasons.
Spring was for plowing and sowing, a burst of intense, hopeful activity. Summer brought the relentless heat, the weeding, and the patient watching of crops. Autumn was the frantic, back-breaking period of harvest, the culmination of all their efforts, dictating the very survival of their family through the coming winter. Winter was a time of cold, scarcity, and reduced outdoor labor, focused on repair, maintenance, and indoor crafts like spinning and weaving. Each season brought its own specific demands, its own unique set of tasks, and its own quality of light and temperature. The moon also played a role, though perhaps less directly in their daily routine than the sun. Its phases influenced tides, which for coastal or river communities affected fishing. For all, the moon's cycle marked the passage of weeks, and its bright presence on a clear night could extend a harvest evening or make a dangerous journey slightly safer. Religious festivals were also often tied to lunar cycles, further integrating celestial movements into their lives. Their own bodies were perhaps the most intimate and reliable timekeepers. Hunger pangs signaled the need for food. Fatigue was the undeniable call for rest. The ebb and flow of energy, the natural desires for warmth or cooling, the instinctual rhythm of their bodily functions, these were profound indicators that needed no external measurement. They learned to listen to their bodies, to work within their limits, though often pushed far beyond them by necessity. The sounds of their world also marked time. The rooster's crow, the church bells. If their village was fortunate enough to have a clock tower, it would be a rare and grand sight, its chimes marking the canonical hours, less for time-telling and more for prayer. The lowing of cattle, the distant shouts of neighbors. These auditory cues provided a rich, organic soundscape of time passing. This existence, untethered by artificial chronology, fostered a different relationship with time itself. There was no concept of wasting time in the modern sense, no anxiety about productivity measured in minutes. Time was simply the unfolding of life, a continuous present. There was no looking back with regret at lost moments, nor forward with anxious anticipation of future deadlines. There was only the immediate, demanding present, shaped by the needs of the earth and the dictates of nature. For the medieval peasant, life without clocks was not a deprivation, but the only way of knowing. Their understanding of time was visceral, holistic, and deeply practical. It was woven into the very fabric of their being, a constant, undeniable connection to the natural world. They lived in profound harmony with the rhythms of the earth, guided by the sun's journey, the moon's phases, the turning of the seasons, and the silent, insistent call of their own hard-working bodies. Their lives were a testament to an ancient way of being, where time was not a commodity to be managed, but a living, breathing force to be experienced, endured, and ultimately deeply understood. Hygiene and dirt, baths were a luxury. In our modern world, hygiene is often an unspoken assumption, a daily ritual ingrained from childhood, facilitated by a constant supply of clean water and sophisticated sanitation. For the medieval peasant, however, the concept of cleanliness was radically different. Far from a daily pursuit, bathing as we understand it was a rare and labor-intensive luxury. Life was lived in intimate proximity to dirt, both literally from the land they tilled and from the constant presence of animals. So a certain pervasive grime was not a sign of neglect, but an inescapable reality, a testament to a life lived without the conveniences that underpin our contemporary standards of hygiene. Imagine the peasant's body after a day in the fields, hands stained with soil, face streaked with sweat and dust, hair matted from exertion. Their coarse woolen clothing, often slept in, would absorb these layers of grime, adding to the pervasive odors of smoke, human exertion, and animal presence. The very air within the hovel, thick with wood smoke and the scent of communal living, contributed to this atmosphere. There was no hot running water, no soap as we know it, no private bathing spaces. Water, in the peasants' world, was a precious commodity. It had to be hauled, often over considerable distances, from a communal well or stream. Every bucket was a heavy burden, every drop carefully rationed. Its primary uses were for cooking, drinking, and rudimentary washing of hands and faces, particularly before meals or after especially dirty tasks. The idea of dedicating large quantities of this vital resource to a full-body bath was simply impractical, if not unthinkable, especially when food and warmth were far more pressing concerns. When a full-body wash did occur, it was a rare and significant event, perhaps once a month or even less frequently, particularly during the colder seasons. It would require considerable effort, heating large pots of water over the open fire, a slow and laborious process. A wooden tub, if the family possessed one, would be brought out and filled. This tub, likely also used for washing clothes or other household tasks, would then serve as the family's communal bath. Imagine the scene. The water, murky with collected grime, would be used by several family members in succession, from the eldest to the youngest. The concept of fresh, individual bathwater was alien. Soap, if available, would be a harsh alkaline concoction made from animal fat and lye, used sparingly. The primary goal was not cleanliness in a sterile sense, but a basic removal of the most egregious layers of dirt, and perhaps a temporary relief from the incessant itching of fleas and lice. Beyond these infrequent full baths, personal hygiene relied on more rudimentary methods. Dry cleaning was common for clothes, brushing off dust and dirt, airing garments, and perhaps beating them to dislodge insects and grime. For their bodies, daily attention was limited to washing hands and faces at the well or with a small basin of cold water. Hair might be combed with a coarse wooden comb, and sometimes simple preparations of herbs or ashes might be rubbed into the scalp to deter lice. But hair washing was infrequent. The peasants' intimate relationship with animals also contributed to the challenges of hygiene. Livestock sharing the hovel or living just outside meant the constant presence of animal waste, flies, and odors. The earthen floors, while swept, could never be truly sanitized. This constant exposure to bacteria and parasites was a significant factor in the prevalence of disease. Yet it's important not to overlay our modern revulsion.
Disease and medicine, the unseen enemy. In the medieval peasants' world, where life was a constant negotiation with the tangible forces of nature, the soil, the weather, the Lord, there existed another, far more insidious and terrifying enemy: disease. This unseen adversary stalked every hovel, every village, striking indiscriminately and often with brutal efficiency. Without a scientific understanding of contagion, without modern sanitation or effective medicine, illness was often viewed through a lens of divine wrath or demonic influence, and the remedies available were, at best, rudimentary, and at worst, fatal. Imagine a peasant household when illness struck: a child burning with fever, a parent racked with coughing, a neighbor crippled by aching joints. The symptoms were visible, the suffering palpable, but the cause was a mystery. They did not know of bacteria or viruses, of poor hygiene contributing to contagion. Instead, illness might be attributed to evil humors within the body, a prevailing medical theory of the time, a curse from an enemy, or, most commonly, a punishment from God
for sins committed. This lack of understanding made disease even more terrifying, an unpredictable force beyond their control. The conditions of their daily lives made them acutely vulnerable. The crowded, smoky hovels, shared with animals, offered little ventilation and fostered the spread of respiratory illnesses. The lack of clean, running water and rudimentary sanitation meant that human and animal waste often contaminated water sources, leading to a constant threat of dysentery, cholera, and other waterborne diseases. The presence of fleas and rats, as discussed earlier, facilitated the spread of bubonic plague and other zoonotic illnesses. Malnutrition, a constant companion, weakened their immune systems, making them more susceptible to any passing contagion. When someone fell ill, the primary caregivers were usually the women of the household, particularly the mother or grandmother. Their knowledge of medicine was a blend of inherited folk remedies, practical experience, and a strong dose of superstition. This might involve brewing teas from local herbs, chamomile for calming, elderberry for fever, willow bark for pain, a natural source of salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Poultices made from crushed plants might be applied to wounds or inflammations. Bloodletting, a common practice based on the humoral theory, might be attempted by a local barber surgeon, if one was available, or even by a village elder. This involved cutting a vein to release bad blood, a practice that often weakened the already sick patient and introduced further infection. Charms, incantations, and prayers to saints were equally, if not more prevalent, reflecting their belief in the spiritual origins of disease. People would wear amulets, visit local shrines, or pay priests to perform special masses, desperately seeking divine intervention. For serious illnesses, or when folk remedies failed, there was little recourse. Professional doctors were a rarity, typically found only in major towns or serving the nobility. Their knowledge, though more formally structured, was often based on outdated Greek and Roman texts and theories like humorism, which had limited efficacy. The concept of surgery was terrifying, often rudimentary and without anesthesia or antiseptics, leading to high rates of infection and death. Childbirth, in particular, was a moment of extreme peril for both mother and infant. Without modern medical intervention, complications were common, and both maternal and infant mortality rates were tragically high. The presence of women, often older and experienced in the birthing chamber, was essential, but their knowledge was empirical, not scientific. The most terrifying manifestation of disease was the epidemic. When widespread illnesses like smallpox, measles, influenza, or, most devastatingly, the Black Death swept through the land, villages could be decimated. There was no quarantine, no understanding of how to stop the spread. Panic, prayer, and desperate flight were often the only responses. These epidemics left deep scars on the collective memory, reinforcing the fragility of life and the overwhelming power of the unseen enemy. In the face of such profound vulnerability, the medieval peasant developed a stoic resilience, an acceptance of suffering as part of the human condition, perhaps even as God's will. They tended to their sick with what little knowledge and resources they possessed, often with immense compassion. Yet the constant threat of illness, the frequent deaths of children and loved ones, cast a long, dark shadow over their lives. Disease was a relentless, silent predator, a stark reminder that even in their simple, enduring existence, their grip on life was tenuous, constantly challenged by the unseen forces that governed their fragile mortality. Seasonal festivals, brief moments of joy and release. In the ceaseless cycle of labor that defined the medieval peasant's world, where life was a constant negotiation with the tangible forces of nature, the soil, the weather, the Lord, there existed another, far more insidious and terrifying enemy: disease. This unseen adversary stalked every hovel, every village, striking indiscriminately and often with brutal efficiency. Without a scientific understanding of contagion, without modern sanitation or effective medicine, illness was often viewed through a lens of divine wrath or demonic influence, and the remedies available were, at best, rudimentary and at worst, fatal. In the seasonal festivals, in the ceaseless cycle of labor that defined the medieval peasant's existence, where hunger was a constant companion and the body a tool for endless toil, true leisure was a concept almost unknown. Yet woven into the very fabric of their year, punctuating the relentless rhythm of the fields and hearth, were the seasonal festivals. These were not merely religious observances, they were brief, cherished moments of collective joy and release. Opportunities for communal celebration, where the weight of hardship lifted, however temporarily, and the human spirit found a vital outlet in dance, song, and simple revelry. These days, often coinciding with specific agricultural milestones or Christian feast days, provided a rare and sanctioned respite from the most arduous fieldwork. The Lord might even relax his demands, allowing his peasants a genuine break from corvée labor, understanding that such releases were essential for maintaining morale and preventing outright rebellion. The focus of these festivals was often the village green or the churchyard, transformed into a temporary hub of communal activity. People would gather, shedding for a few precious hours the grim weariness that usually clung to them. The air, usually filled with the scent of damp earth and smoke, would now carry the fainter, more festive aromas of simple food cooked communally. Perhaps a rarity like roasted meat, or more typically, larger quantities of freshly baked bread and brewed ale or cider. Music, often simple and unrefined, would fill the air. A pipe, a drum, a crude stringed instrument, these would provide the rhythm for dance. Peasants, their bodies usually stiff from labor, would engage in folk dances, simple steps and communal movements that allowed for joyous physical expression. Children would chase and play, their laughter echoing, their youthful energy released in unbridled exuberance. These moments of uninhibited movement were stark contrast to the purposeful, disciplined actions of their work, a vital release for bodies and spirits. Games would also be played. Simple forms of wrestling, foot races, or local variations of ball games might emerge. These were opportunities for friendly competition, for men and boys to display their strength and agility, to find camaraderie outside the shared toil of the fields. For a brief period, the harsh realities of their social hierarchy might soften, and a shared sense of community would prevail. The consumption of ale or cider was a key component of these celebrations. Brewed locally, often by the peasants themselves or by a village alewife, these fermented beverages were safer to drink than often contaminated water and provided a welcome, if mild, intoxication. They loosened inhibitions, encouraged laughter, and made the heavy realities of life a little lighter, if only for a short time. The communal sharing of drink reinforced social bonds, fostering a sense of warmth and solidarity. Storytelling, already a vital part of their nightly ritual, would take on a more boisterous and public form. Old tales would be recounted with renewed vigor, jokes shared, and the collective memory of the village brought to life. Perhaps a traveling minstrel or peddler might pass through, bringing news and songs from other villages, adding a rare touch of the outside world to their insular existence. Religious elements remain central to many festivals. Processions, blessings of the fields, and special church services would intertwine with the secular revelry. The saints were invoked, thanksgiving.
We have journeyed through a day, a year, and indeed a lifetime of the medieval peasant. We have seen the dawn ritual, the mud and smoke of their homes, the coarse layers of their attire, the monotonous gruel, and the unyielding labor in the fields under the watchful eye of the Lord. We have observed their struggles with disease, their reliance on ancient preservation, and the profound, all-encompassing power of the Church.
To our modern gaze, this life appears undeniably harsh, characterized by poverty, hardship, and a pervasive sense of what we might call misery. Yet, to conclude that their lives were devoid of meaning, or even of a profound, enduring satisfaction, would be to fundamentally misunderstand the peasants' world, for their existence was imbued with a deep, undeniable sense of cosmic purpose. Imagine, first, the peasants' understanding of their place in the universe. It was not one of individual aspiration or self-fulfillment, but of being an integral, indispensable part of a divinely ordained order. The great chain of being, from God to angels to kings to lords, and finally to the peasantry and the earth itself, was a sacred hierarchy. Their position, though lowly, was understood as divinely appointed. Their labor was not merely for their own survival, but for the sustenance of the entire societal structure, from the knights who defended the realm to the clergy who prayed for their souls. This profound sense of being a necessary part of a greater whole provided a powerful, undeniable meaning to their incessant toil. Their connection to the land was another deep wellspring of purpose. The earth was not an abstract resource to be exploited. It was a living entity, a mother from whom all sustenance flowed. Every furrow plowed, every seed sown, every harvest reaped was a direct, visceral act of communion with this fundamental force. The success of their labor was immediately tangible, directly translating into food on their table, the survival of their family. This direct correlation between effort and outcome, however meager, lent dignity and profound meaning to every swing of the scythe, every ache in their back. They were not detached workers, they were caretakers of the very source of life. The family unit was a bedrock of meaning. In a world with little external support, the family was their economy, their social security, their emotional refuge. Raising children was not a burden, but a continuation, an act of ensuring the lineage, passing on the accumulated wisdom and resilience of generations. The children were their future, their hope, and their immortality. The shared struggles, the communal meals by firelight, the huddling together for warmth in the straw nest, these acts, born of necessity, forged unbreakable bonds of love, loyalty, and mutual dependence, providing a deep emotional core to their lives. Community, the village network we explored, was another vital layer of meaning. Life was not lived in isolation. The shared labor in the common fields, the collective celebrations of seasonal festivals, the exchange of gossip and news at the well, these interactions wove a rich tapestry of human connection. They knew their neighbors, their stories, their struggles, and their triumphs. In times of crisis, the village rallied together. This profound sense of belonging, of being part of a resilient, interconnected group, provided both practical support and an immense feeling of shared humanity, a powerful antidote to loneliness or despair. And then there was the church, the ultimate arbiter of meaning. While it instilled fear, it also offered ultimate solace and a profound sense of cosmic purpose. Their suffering on earth was not meaningless. It was a path to salvation, a means of earning eternal reward in heaven. Every prayer, every pilgrimage, every observance of a feast day was an act of faith, a step closer to divine grace. The rituals, the Latin, the sacred imagery, even if not fully understood intellectually, provided a powerful sensory connection to the divine, imbuing their harsh lives with spiritual significance.
The promise of a better life after death was perhaps the most profound source of hope and meaning for a people whose earthly existence was so often fraught with misery. Therefore, while their lives were undeniably arduous, steeped in physical misery and constant struggle, the medieval peasant was not necessarily miserable in spirit. Their world, though lacking in material comforts, was rich in purpose, connection, and a profound, unquestioning faith. They lived in deep harmony with the natural world, their bodies and souls attuned to its ancient rhythms. They found satisfaction in mastery, solace in community, and ultimate meaning in their cosmic role. Their enduring legacy is not just one of relentless toil, but of a quiet, profound resilience, a powerful testament to the human capacity to find dignity, connection, and even a unique form of joy within the most demanding of circumstances. Their lives, in their simplicity and unvarnished truth, offered a profound and enduring lesson in what it truly means to be human, bound to the earth and reaching for the heavens.